Today we're gonna make an experimental beat. I'm gonna show you some wild sampling techniques, weird drum pattern ideas, crazy arrangement tips, and a lot more. So let's get into it. Let's start this beat by finding a sample. Now instead of finding a typical jazz or soul sample, I'm gonna find something more experimental, since this is an experimental beat. And I'm not gonna overthink it, I'm literally just gonna search for weird samples and see what I can find in one of these playlists. Alright, this is weird enough, so let's load this up into our sampler and turn this into a beat. But before we do, if you guys like these Overexplained types of videos, hit like and subscribe and let me know down in the comments. Now one reason why I like this sample is because it has synthetic sounds in it. And here's why I like using synthetic sounds. The great thing about synthetic sounds and samples is that you can manipulate them in far more extreme ways and it will still sound usable. Here you can see I slowed the sample down to play at 4.5 BPM. And here's how this technique would sound if I tried the exact same thing with a soul sample instead. You can hear it sounds pretty bad. Acoustic samples don't allow for this much flexibility when you're using this type of extreme sample manipulation. So now I'm going to place chops at these different synth notes and this part of the sample and start by building out my main loop here. Now here's another reason why I really like this sample. Notice what's going on with the pitches of each of these chops. You can see I re-pitched one of them. And the sample being so opened and simple allowed me to do this much more easily. So now that I have a basic melodic idea, I'm gonna add guitar rig onto this loop. That synth that's in the sample sounds kind of plain right now, so I wanna use some creative effects to see what I can do with it. What I really like about this effect is the pitch modulation. You can see as this effect turns on and off, it adds this pitched up layer of the synth. Now you can also hear the sample does have that percussion in it, which I could definitely clean up using a stem splitter, but I'm gonna keep it in for now. We'll see whether we want to remove it from the beat or not eventually. Moving on though, let's start by building out the drum pattern around this loop. Now with this BPM, typically we might lean towards making a boom bap beat, but this is where I'm gonna do some experimentation. Whenever I would zig, I'm gonna zag instead. So instead of boom bap drums for an 84 BPM beat, I'm gonna use trap drums instead. And this hi-hat and these percussion sounds. So we have mostly trappy sounds here. Now you might be sitting there thinking I'm about to zag again, but this time I'm gonna zig. This is what experimenting is all about. So with my snare pattern, I usually say a great place to start is by putting a snare on the 2 and the 4. But again, I'm gonna experiment with some of these notes and create a drill trap hybrid snare pattern. And for the kick pattern, I'm going to place some notes where typically there would be some snares. Again, just being outrageous here. We are getting wild with this beat. Next up, the hi-hat pattern and these percussion sounds. Alright, so we have the drum pattern done with some unusual ideas in it. Let's think about the bass line next. Again, I have trap drums, so the usual pairing of an 808 is what you might be thinking. But instead, I'm going to go with this synth bass here. I'm going to create a pattern that follows that main synth loop for the most part. So I think this is enough for the main loop, but as with many experimental beats, the arrangement is where the beat really shines. Therefore, I'm going to work on this arrangement and we'll be right back. Alright, so I'm finished pretending like I just made this beat. Here's what we have. This beat split up into 3 major switch-ups, so what I'll do is play this all for you and take you through some of the arrangement tips and tricks afterwards. Feel free to skip ahead if you want.
How delightful. How delightful.
So I started this beat by just using one of these chops from the sample that I showed before, but I used some pitch modulation on it. I cranked the pitch up an octave, and then as it goes on, it drops until we go back to the normal pitch. So we have this tape stoppish effect. As we get into the beat, we have the usual background sounds and samples to fill up space, but also help with the transition.
How delightful.
This vocal sample here is actually from another song from the same artist that I sampled for the original main loop.
How delightful.
Now in this part of the arrangement, we have an idea that I recommend often when it comes to your arrangements, which is to blur the lines. Instead of starting the entire beat and having all the sounds come in at once, I brought in the drums a little bit later and the sample loop early to help this transition sound a little bit less predictable.
How delightful.
By the way, if turning your loop into a full beat is a struggle for you, this is one of the many topics that I cover inside Better Beatmaker, my online beatmaking course. If you need direct guidance and help to figure out how to make better beatmaking decisions, that's exactly what Better Beatmaker will help you with. Link is in the description box below if you want to learn more. Now later on in this beat, as we get into the first mini switch up, I have this pattern that I use just once in this beat. This is actually the exact same sample, but this time I pitched it up an octave and I just used a different guitar rig preset. And for this small switch up, I just dropped the hi-hats and I used the synth from Pigments. Initially, I just used the exact same pattern in this area twice, but I've been getting lazy with my arrangements recently, so I forced myself to make a different pattern, as you can see here. After this, we get back into the normal loop with this additional layer in the beat. Then we get into the first major switch up. This is something that I talked about in a video that I made before on JPEG Mafia. When it comes to making beat switch ups, it can help to create a connection between the two sections. So for example, you can see to start this switch up, I used a familiar sound that I did from the intro, which is that exact same synth from the sample. And I extended the bass and sample patterns out to continue to play during this transition period. Again, the idea of blurring the lines here. I used some samples and sounds to help fill up space once again, but once you get back into the full beat, you'll notice I used some of the exact same sounds as the section prior, like the bass as well as the same synth to create this loop here. Again, this just helps create continuity so the beat doesn't sound way too different. The major difference in this section, for one, is the drum break. I switched over to a more glitchy boom bap drum break that I just took from my boom bap kit. And partway through, we have this guitar that comes in. This is from Contact Session Guitars. The good thing about this preset is that it isn't just a single note that plays. It actually plays a guitar pattern with its own rhythm, which is helpful. And then as we get into the final section of the beat, you can see I'm just using a similar technique. I'm just letting the guitar continue to play as we transition into the third and final switch up. This last section of the beat uses the same drum sounds and samples and guitar as a way to fill up space in the beat and also create that continuity again. But I also threw in this additional percussion loop and vocal sample for this final idea, along with that big 808 that you heard. Now when I brought in this 808, I realized that the note has this gap at the end of it, and so I decided to play into that idea. And so I cut out the pattern so the beat stops with the 808, and we have this in and out, up and down feeling in the beat. To help this transition sound better, instead of having this huge impactful 808 start us off immediately, I sort of just faded it in. I did this by reversing it and then playing with the automation. That way we don't have too much happening all at once. And you can see I also blend the drums during this transition section here. And then for the outro, I use the same idea as the intro. I just use some pitch automation and fade out that synth beeping. And I also just use another segment from that weird sample, and that's pretty much it.
How delightful.
And that is how I made this experimental beat, by blending a lot of different ideas from different subgenres and mushing them all together. So hopefully you like this beat. If so, hit like and subscribe. And if you're a fan of these experimental beats, think about checking out this video that I made on JPEG Mafia next to me. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next week.